So, can you hear me properly?
Yes, yes, very loud. So, just for your information, we are broadcasting this event live on YouTube.
Okay. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
So, shall I start?
Just give me a moment, please.
Okay.
So, uh, let me extend warm welcome. Good evening, everyone from India. Welcome to GRFDT Special Lecture Series on Migration and Diaspora. This lecture series is also a part of six months long online certificate program on Global Compact for Migration. The program is jointly being offered by Migrant Forum in Asia, Philippines, Cross Regional Center for Refugee and Migration, CCRM Lebanon, Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism, New Delhi, India, and Civil Society Action Committee, Geneva, Switzerland. So today I am very fortunate and I'm very glad to introduce Professor Parvati Nair for a lecture on social cost of migration. Ma'am, welcome to this forum. I'm very happy to introduce. I'm very happy to have you here, and I was actually literally waiting for your lectures since the day you confirmed for this. So for participants, Professor Parvati Nair is a professor of Hispanic Cultural and Migration Studies and head of the School of Languages, Linguistic and Film in the Queen Mary University of London. Professor Nair is the founding director of the United Nations University Institute on Globalization, Culture and Mobility (UNUGCM). She has been very instrumental in the process of global compact for migration. Her research focuses on basically on community migration, displacement, marginality, ethnicity, gender, and cultural memory. Much of her work has focused on these issues as represented in photography, film, and music. She has written extensively. Her first two books focused solely on Spain in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Her subsequent research has acquired a broader and more comprehensive comparative focus. She is interested in studying questions of culture, identity, memory, and narrative in terms of travel, translation, and translocation. She is also the founder and principal editor of Crossings, Journal of Migration and Culture. So with these small I could have gone for like she has done so many works. She has long history of publications, writing a number of articles, books. So I do not have much time. I could have spoken along, but with these words, I would like to welcome Madam for this to this forum. Ma'am,
Thank you
over
so
to you.
much.
And I'll be here. I'll be muted, and I'll be here in case of anything. You can call me anytime. We have like this all depends on you. You can go as much as you can. Otherwise, we'll appreciate 50 to 60 minutes maximum. Then we'll try to have some sort of question answer things. If participants will have to share something, they can also share. So over to you, madam. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ranjan, and thank you, and thanks to Dr. Sada, to everybody from GFRDT for this invitation to speak. It's a real honor, and I think especially in this time of lockdown and pandemic, as you know, I'm based in London. We are in a very severe lockdown at the moment, so it's really living at home and being housebound for many months now, and it's a real pleasure to be able to reach out to colleagues with shared interests and expertise. And I should say that I'm very excited as well to be collaborating with GFRDT and colleagues, especially Dr. Smita Tiwari and Dr. Rakesh Ranjan, on a project that we are just embarking on, a collaborative project which we are just starting, and we're very excited to be doing that. And I'm very honored to have this invitation. And also, I should say that I am also very much in admiration of the work that you do, that the way in which you reach out to a global audience and making knowledge and discussion and debate discussions on these issues that are so vitally important locally and globally possible for a truly global audience. So I'm very lucky, fortunate to be part of that. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. So when Dr. Sada kindly invited me to give this talk, he asked me to speak on the social costs of migration. And that made me think about migration in a different way, because of course I've always been working for a long time in the area of migration, and always based partly on my own personal experience of life, but also living in a city that is as cosmopolitan and international as London. I think, I've always seen migration as a positive, as a great positive, and to think about it in terms of costs.
I think some network problem. Uh,
Hello, I think we got cut off. Can you hear
yes,
me now? Can you
yes,
hear me now? Yes.
yes.
Okay, so that's one of the perils of digital connection. But anyway, let's hope that it continues. Okay, smoothly from now on. So basically, I was saying that, migration studies generally have been approached from within a range of um, disciplines within the social sciences. But my own background is not so much squarely within the social sciences, but rather within a broader remit of the humanities and social sciences. My training is as a Hispanist in Hispanic studies, and I did my PhD in Hispanic cultural studies on the question of community. I was looking specifically at what happens to the idea and practices of community in Spain after 36 years of dictatorship, as they transitioned to democracy and were looking to become part of the European, what was then the European Community, and later would become the European Union. So looking at what happens to the idea, practices, and narratives of community identities within the context of free market economies. And that led me to having an interest in marginal communities, communities that were either disempowered or different because of ethnicity, because of migration, various different contexts. And as Dr. Ranjan rightly said, my early work was very much focused on the borders of North Africa and Spain. As you know, this is an area which is actually um, quite close. There's only 14 kilometers by sea between the northernmost point of Africa and the southernmost point of Spain, which is the southernmost point of Europe. And until recently, when it became, in the last 20 years, it has become a highly securitized zone. But before that, it was the most common crossing point from Africa into Europe. And that included not only Africans, but as I will share with you later, also people from other other parts of the world who went there in order to try and access Europe. My work has looked very much on questions of cultural memory, identity, ethnicity, and displacement. And I've usually approached these topics through two methods that I combine. One is the study of text in the broad sense. I don't mean necessarily printed text, but specifically photography in my case, and also film. I've also written on music a little bit, but looking at cultural expressions and representations in culture, and also looking at lived experiences, so doing ethnography and fieldwork. To bring these two methods together, this has been my effort, in order to have a better understanding of the ways in which mobility and migrancy is experienced at ground level and the ways in which they are represented and perceived in mainstream society and media. My methods are, as you can see, largely qualitative. Of course, one has to refer to data sometimes, but my own analysis is qualitative, and I am very keen on combining or ensuring fieldwork happens alongside theoretical and textual or image analysis. And I think it's always important that when we are looking at issues to do with individuals and collectives, such as issues of identity or memory at group level, what are our traditions, what are our values, what do we remember of the places we came from, it's always important also to contextualize this within a larger framework that includes an awareness of larger ideological, political, economic trends. As Dr. Ranjan said, I also spent 7 years working in the United Nations, where I was heading a research institute on globalization, culture, and mobility. And we were at that time, I was working for the United Nations University, and we were at the time the chair in 2016 of the Global Migration Group, precisely at the time when the UN Secretary General put a call for two global compacts to be worked on, one for refugees and the other for safe, orderly, and regular migration. So I was the Global Migration Group's working level chair in 2016. The Global Migration Group is a forum of 22 agencies of the United Nations that came together, sitting around the table, virtual table, I should say, because some are in Geneva, some are in New York, and others are elsewhere in the world. And we were working on the early drafts of the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which was subsequently discussed and negotiated by member states and then signed by the majority of the 193 states that we had hoped would sign. Of course, some of them did not in the end, so several pulled out, the US under Trump being one of the first countries, being the first country to pull out. But the vast majority of countries did sign, which means that regionally and globally, we have an overwhelming commitment by member states to the well-being, safety of migrants. So this experience for me is very useful because until then I had been a humanities academic working without really understanding the different issues at stake at the policy level. And I think it's extremely important in migration to look at migration policy and see how that policy actually is lived out by people who are moving, by societies that are affected by moving. And these are some of the things that I want to talk about today for us to discuss. But also to look at the ways in which practices of migration actually are hugely affected and conditioned by policies which are perhaps not which are perhaps skewed in favor of ideas of nationhood, borders, and sovereignty. The centrality of sovereignty as a thinking tool around migration can create huge human rights issues around migration for a significant number of people. And this is obviously a concern, and it continues to be a concern. However, and most of my work has been on international migration, but some of the issues that I deal with, such as memory, identity, etc., these are all issues which are also pertinent to internal migration, particularly in large countries such as India, which is a very diverse country with so many languages, etc. So, depending on where we're talking, there are some issues which are in common, some which are distinct, quite specific to international cross-border migration. But speaking about international migration, there are actually around 258 million international migrants in the world at the moment. And by that, I mean people with origins in one country living in another country. And then, of course, on top of that, we have to add the fact that there are a vast number of people who are internal migrants, regional migrants within countries which have cross-border arrangements, etc. And if we look at migration as one of the sort of big mass phenomena of the world we live in, one of the big, most common human experiences, and indeed, I think going back in time, we all know that the history of humanity is a migration story. Then I think we can see in the modern era particularly that there are other mass phenomena that have taken place and are taking place, which are intricately linked to migration. And these are, of course, the processes of industrialization, urbanization, globalization. Migration, therefore, is not a phenomenon that occurs in isolation. Of course not. Nothing that affects people, just happens to people. People are always in contexts. And for migration, I think we need to bear in mind that migration, many issues and many experiences of migrants, and the whole phenomenon of migration is symptomatic of the larger context we live in, the larger context of market-led economies, of the ideological context that supports the free market, if you like, and capitalism. And it is symptomatic of the modern era. It is, of course, something that predates the modern era, and we have many, many instances historically of migrations, but it has become much more of a phenomenon in the modern era alongside the development, creation, establishment of nation states and the idea of borders. So if we look back at migration studies and we look at the emergence of migration studies in the 19th century via George Ravenstein's laws of migration, and this was perhaps the earliest instance of migration studies as a discipline, we can see how, as a geographer, his interest in cartography or map making led him to not only to map places, but to actually give definition and meaning to places through the lives and the people who were living there or moving from one place to another. So places and maps came to life by tracing how, by whom, and why space is used and covered by people. And Ravenstein, of course, was working initially in the UK and then went on to and came up with his initial 7 laws of migration. And then he went on to do a similar study of the United States, where migration was happening in a big way in the 19th century, with more and more land being taken up by people who had moved there. And he came up with 11 laws of migration. But of course, what we see is that the overriding trend in that period in the 19th century, a trend that continues today, is from rural areas to urban areas, and the expansion of urban areas outwards, so that cities get ever bigger and ever more, they expand ever more as much as they can geographically. Some cities cannot, if they are, for example, between mountains and the sea. So they're geographically enclosed, but others can. So we see the sprawl of the urban space and the movement of people to that sprawl that creates the need for that expansion, if you like. So there's a dynamic there. We need to think very clearly in terms of the social sciences. We need to understand that many of these disciplines emerged precisely because of certain phenomena that were happening, processes that were underway in that very, very interesting and incredibly relevant century of the 19th century, when so much of the world that we take for granted today, including the world of photography and images, came into being. And the move to cities, the emergence of industrialization on a mass scale across the world through colonization, through empire, etc. These are all sort of key aspects of why people were migrating. There was in the UK, for example, there was massive industrialization, very rapid urban expansion, very a huge investment, largely through funds and monies that came in via slave trade or via colonization from the empires, from the imperially controlled lands such as India was to the UK. Rapid building in cities such as London, where we have these 19th century architecture across the city, and you can see you can look at the history of buildings and you can trace back the migration story that led to those buildings still being here today. So we see the circulation of capital that is typical of the modern era, that draws people in its wake, that uproots and disturbs rural ways of life or traditional ways of life. And we see numerous relocations and reinventions of ways of life from the rural to the urban. These are all global phenomena from the 19th century to the present day, and probably, who knows, what lies beyond a global pandemic, but perhaps it will continue. They're global and local phenomena that show the intimate and evolving relationships between people and place. People gain their meaning from where they are and the places they're in, and places likewise gain their meanings from the people and the lives that cross those places and define them. Urban expansion, extensive building work, extensive investment in cities, for example, funds from various sources, funding sources that show global business that has been taking place from Europe to its colonies for many centuries now. The flow of money and the movements of people, these are all interconnected. And we see that it can happen. It happens in a succession of ways, from the locally, from the rural to the urban, but also from the rural and the urban, across borders, internationally, across seas. So, the history of oceans, for example, gives us a wonderful sense of of the movements of people, through trade. And if you look at the work of someone like David Abulafia, for example, who has done a wonderful history of the Mediterranean Sea, we see how that Mediterranean Sea was a crucial connector between Europe and Asia, as well as Europe and Africa. So we see how migration is a social phenomenon that is triggered by strategic and ideological interests of empire, conquest, and political and capital expansion. And I would say that this is still the case, even if it is not overtly so in the way it was before. It is about political and capital expansion and empowerment at both personal and collective levels. So migration is not merely a demographic phenomenon. It's one that impacts upon, shapes, and recreates space and place, so that people must be considered in the context of who they are and where they are. And also, we need to understand that when people move from one place to another, they're not just arriving in a place, they're leaving a place. And so mass migration can also mean the undoing of a place in the way that it was, the undoing of entire ways of life, the undoing of communities, of value systems, of beliefs, of identities. And this is again very, very clear in many, many parts of the world, where we see, for example, and Southern Europe is a case in point. Recently, last year, just before the pandemic and just for about a year before that, various mayors in small towns in Italy were putting houses up for sale at €1 per house. And you could buy a house in Italy, in Sicily, for €1. And this is because in those towns, those houses were falling apart simply because of depopulation. And what the mayors were trying to do was to encourage people to commit to spending €5,000 in the first 5 years in rebuilding or repairing homes, but they could purchase the home and have it for €1. And it was something that many Northern Europeans who wanted a summer house in the sun took up. And but this has happened because of mass emigration from those places, particularly youth emigration. The falling apart of a place, of a city, of a town, a village, from the way it used to be for many centuries, the whole taking apart of that lifestyle because the youth have gone to the big cities of Milan or Madrid or Paris in order to become urban workers. And there's a wonderful novel by a Spanish novelist called Julio Llamazares called Yellow Rain, La Lluvia Amarilla, which is about the last surviving inhabitant of a village when everyone else has either died or gone away to work elsewhere. There are also many cases of return migration. And across the centuries, in terms of colonization, there's been a lot of movement of people who went to the colonies and came back. Likewise, these days with free, easy movement across countries and travel, there are people who believe that they can go away for a while and they come back. But inevitably, return is never to the very place that you left. The place has changed while you were away as well, in the same ways you yourself will have changed. So we look, for example, at new hybrid identities and the dynamic of identity as process, which comes to the fore when we look at the context of migration, and we look at places and communities through the lens of migration. And then, of course, there is the expulsion, the undoing of place, largely, for example, through climate emergencies, environmental emergencies that make places not inhabitable anymore. This is happening in many parts of Africa and many other places, as we well know. And if we take, for example, situations as in Africa, in the Sahel region, we can see a combination of factors that creates a context where people are not technically seen as refugees, but are tantamount to being climate refugees because of the inhospitability anymore of the land through environmental degradation, the consequences of poverty, inequality, and conflict, all of which combine to make places into very difficult places to live in, where young people looking for opportunities, obviously, would want to move. So theoretically, migration and its costs need to be read and analyzed, thought of in terms of modernity and the upheavals of the modern way of life and modern thinking, modern ideologies, modern practices, which are largely framed by capitalism. If we look at Marshall Berman's book, All That Is Solid Melts into Air, that was written as long ago as 1982, and I warmly recommend that book to anyone who is wanting to study this phenomenon further. All that is solid into air is an analysis of the modern way of life and what it is. And he argues that the modern period is one of what he calls maelstrom or uprootings and upheavals, of scatterings and dispersal of whole ways of life, beliefs, priorities. And there are many factors that contribute to this: empire making, subsequently decolonization, the formation of nation states, urban expansion, the massive shifts from agriculture to industrialization, mounting forces of capital, which create a very uneven and cracked social landscape, both globally and nationally, and create political and economic maps that show fractures, inequalities, imbalances of power, and heartlands and peripheries of capital, so that regardless of whether we are officially an empire or not, whether we are part of an empire or not, there are the heartlands and peripheries of capital that determine so much of what follows. And if I take photography as a case in point, many photographers, and particularly I refer here to Shahidul Alam, who is a photographer and founder of the Drik photography school in Bangladesh, in Dhaka. He would has clearly stated that to be a world-class photographer, you have to have, your work has to be recognized in Paris, in London, in New York, in these great, old centers of capital. And if you're in Dhaka, you're much less privileged. It's not enough you show your work in Dhaka. Similarly, I have been following some young musicians from small towns in India, and I'm fascinated by the ways in which these very young people, who probably may not have traveled much outside of India in their lifetimes because they're still at school, are able to move in a very versatile way from Indian music to Western music and back. And they have a very wide range of musical ability. If you were to take a young musician of the same age group and in the West, it is highly unlikely that they would have that wonderful range. And that is a typical feature of the post-colonial. But that sense of multiple locations, multiple affiliations is also part of the sort of split and the unease of post-colonial identities, which are also in a way very much linked to migration and migrant experiences, because it is the experience of being here and there in two places, in two times at the same time, which is, of course, a sense of dissonance, an experience of dissonance. Another aspect of the modern way of living is risk-taking. And I think I'm certainly no expert in the stock market or in financial investments, but I think that we all know the vocabulary of the stock market and taking risks, making investments, hedging your bets. These are all ways in which people work to expand capital. And it features large in the migration adventure that people embark upon. It's a Russian roulette, and there are many winners, and there are some very, very serious losers in the game of human mobility. And there are lots of people in between. There are the brokers and the agents and the smugglers and the traffickers. So there are many traps. It's a very, very costly and dangerous route to take. There is also questions, as I said, of nationhood, sovereignty, citizenship that are defined by others, boundaries, the idea of borders. So alongside the idea of risk, there's also the question of crossing borders, crossing over. And the question of borders is very significant and important in the definition of how we see ourselves as opposed to how we see others. And of course, this idea of borders reveals, if you like, the weakness in national thinking around hospitality and welcome. As the French philosopher Jacques Derrida has written in his essay Foreigner Question around home ownership, the question of owning your home and how you would welcome or not the stranger into your home. The alterity is how we view alterity, how we view the other, places limits on hospitality, to what extent we are willing to be hospitable. And it is this tension that constructs the borders of the self with the other. And indeed, at a collective level, hospitality in itself implies that at some point that would end and transfer into inhospitality. So this self-other relationship is, of course, a key aspect of what makes migration risky, what puts cost on migration, because it is about nationalism, as we see here in the UK, populism, indeed even in India with the Citizenship Act, etc. We can see very clearly those who are welcome, those who are not. and very strong anti-migrant sentiment in many parts of the world. To quote a Syrian refugee living in Cairo now, who is a photographer, and her name is Sima Diab, she says, the more we see the other as part of ourselves, as a part of us, our own, the less we keep othering them. Then, in terms of migration, there is also the question of absence and presence. Wonderful sociologist who is no more, the late Abdul Malik Sayed, in his book, The Suffering of the Immigrant, talks about how, and he talks about his experience as an immigrant from Algeria to France. He talks about absence and presence. He talks about the fact that he goes to a new country where he is nobody, from having been somebody in his hometown, in his community. He's both here and there, mentally and emotionally. He does not quite belong to either anymore because he has uprooted himself. And especially this is the case with undocumented migrants. So he talks about the fact of recognition and non-recognition, presence and absence. And he talks about the experience of migration as life lived in absentia, life lived in terms of absences as well as partial presences. There's also the question of dignity. And in the UN, they're very fond of this word, and a lot of the work is done around, particularly around the sustainable development goals, is around the dignity of both the humans and the planet. And I think this is very much a case, particularly in terms of post-colonial migration, where there are differences very visibly of ethnicity, race, the emergence of ghettos, including whole neighborhoods or parts of cities, which become places that mainstream members of society never visit, or places from which migrants where they will live and then they will go to work in other parts of the city, altered social spheres. So the construction within local spaces of margins and spaces of disempowerment. And then there is the splitting of lives. The splitting of lives, meaning that the experience of migration for many, regardless of how privileged one may be, the experience is one of belonging to multiple places, belonging to a multi-sidedness and a lack of clarity or definition in terms of identity. And there are many, many works, many, many expressions of this experience in literature, in art, in photography, etc., in film. It's about a here and a there, an absence and a presence, a partial participation in multiple communities, and about the impossibility then of having a place, a single place to belong to. And this is increasingly so, and I think the pandemic has really brought this home, where we have transnational communities, remote intimacies, virtual realities, which clash with with what we experience physically. So the condition of migrancy then is also, of course, in one that has not remained the same because it evolves according to the larger context that we're in. So there is the question of, there used to be certainly the word emigrant, immigrant, refugee, asylum seeker, migrant. Increasingly, one thing that I've noticed is that the media uses the word migrant, and it's never very clear to me how long you remain a migrant for. When do you become an immigrant? When do you become a citizen? These things are not, can you be a citizen from another country and then still be a migrant or a tourist? There's a multiple language, vocabulary, richness of vocabulary around human mobility. And I think that but what is perhaps a very important factor is to bear in mind the multiple connections for an increasingly mobile segment of humanity in an increasingly mobilized world. Memories from one place, perhaps trauma that has been suffered along the way, perhaps not, time spent in transit certainly, hopes which may be pinned in onto another place, imaginations as well of return, impossibilities of return, question marks around belonging, material investments in one place, emotional investments or value investments or religious investments in another place, and a big question mark around the idea of home. And that brings me back to the question of place, of home, location, relocation, again, lived in terms of plurality, and also in terms of finite time periods. Because if home originally denoted some kind of stability and sense of origin, then that stability is certainly thrown up into the air by experiences of relocation, reconstructing, remaking home as a space of, so that home becomes a complex space, a space of imagination, memory, traditions, values, customs, personal connections, which may not be in sync with the larger picture of the migrant life. I would like to move now quickly to two case studies, two or three contexts that I would like to share with you before we open up for discussion. One is a project that that I worked on called Women of the World, Home and Work in Barcelona. I was living in Barcelona for 6 years when I was working at the UNU. And we conducted a project with 16 first-generation immigrant women. I just wanted to say that around 48 to 49% of international migrants are women. And many of them, it used to be, and this number has not actually changed greatly across the decades, but for until about 30 to 40 years ago, the vast number of women who migrated went in terms of family relocation. So in order to join husbands who had already migrated. This is not so anymore. Increasingly, the women who migrate internationally are women who go to work. So we looked at 16 first-generation immigrant women from 16 countries and the 4 main continents of the world. They came from a mix of social classes and educational levels. And what we were trying to understand were the processes of relocation and transnational living in the city, particularly looking at the connection, the nexus of home and work. So remaking home and finding work, or finding work and being able to remake home. So we're looking at that home-work dynamic. So we're looking at how finding work and working in a city enables them or not to feel more at home, and also how they contributed back to the city. What did they do to change the social fabric of the city? Their occupations were of a wide range, from being waitresses, cleaners, nannies, office workers, businesswomen, entrepreneurs, teachers, political representatives of migrant women as well. And we worked with them for a period of 6 months through repeated conversations and the use also of taking oral histories and photography. In terms of photography, they were the ones who determined where in the city they would like to be photographed and why. Often there were places that were meaningful to them, or places where they had had an impact. And obviously, what one found was that while the majority of women migrating internationally these days do so for professional reasons, for work reasons, nevertheless, many of them, the majority, are in precarious employment. They are working in the informal sector as cleaners, nannies, care workers. A lot of them are in care work. Where they're documented, they might be nurses, or they might still be in relatively low paid work with little or no rights. In some cases, in some countries, they're subject to abuses, have limited freedoms, and limited opportunities as well for professional development that come to them through their work. But overall, what we found from this project and the sort of related research that we did was that the experience of migration had fundamentally altered the way in which they lived and practiced the idea of gender in terms of womanhood. The migration had given a new meaning to womanhood. It had given them certain freedoms and led them to new behaviors and to using inventiveness and imagination in terms of coping with new contexts. They had also certain fears and anxieties. They were anxious about how they would be regarded back at home in some cases. They were worried in some cases that they were losing a sense of who they were because of changed values or different contexts. Some were aware of leading double lives, one which was the one that they would lead when they went back to their countries on holiday, another one that they led when they were in the countries that they lived in. There were also interesting shifts in the way in which they regarded marriage, motherhood, and men in general masculinity. There were different family patterns. There were many, many cases of people who were working and had children back in their countries being looked after by their parents. So that actually one of the sort of emotional costs of being a migrant was being far away from seeing one's children grow up, having a Skype relationship with the family, being present every day, but not in the same immediate way that one could be physically. And also very different household structures whereby they became the providers. In some cases, they also had husbands or partners who were not in work or were working in different countries, or in some cases were working with them in Spain. But there were definitely a whole range of emotions that they felt: loneliness, excitement, determination that they must succeed to help the family back home in order to feel good about themselves, learning to cope, learning a new language, opening up their horizons. Obviously, the context of Barcelona is politically a very specific one that is that of Catalonia within Spain, and the approach taken by the city to migrants is one of welcome, whereby all migrants have access to not only free healthcare but also free language lessons and culture lessons. So they were immediately in networks where they met others who had recently arrived, and often these were transnational networks. They also had ways in which they used the city to meet up with people from their own countries in parks, on their day off, etc. And over time, we saw that they became cultural ambassadors. They were very keen on taking part with the support of the city in festivities around, for example, the Chinese New Year or Eid or various other festivals. They were also feeling very emotionally responsible for care, not only to the people, often they were children or elderly that they were looking after, but also to their families who were back home. They saw themselves also as role models for the younger generation. So there was a lot of support and discussion with the younger generation that would go on via Skype and opening up possibilities for them to emigrate in the future. So again, we saw that their idea of home was very ambivalent. It was both here and there, but neither here nor there. And also that there was the sense of identity and belonging as a process, a keen awareness that they were not who they had been brought up to be or whom they had expected to be. Life had taken them down different routes and they needed to figure out their way. So there was this sense also of being on a journey of personal and public discovery. And also that they made major contributions to the city by participating in neighborhoods, in schools, etc. The other second case study that I would like to quickly share with you is that of two men that I met in a group of 38 men, and I have been tracking their life stories and their evolution as migrants, as citizens, as transnational subjects for the last 18 years. I met them exactly 18 years ago in early 2003 in a small colonial city of Spain that is physically in the Moroccan mainland in North Africa. It's a city called Ceuta. In Arabic, it's called Sabta, but in Spanish, it's called Ceuta. This is a very small city. It's a port city which regularly receives ships from around the world because it's on the Straits of Gibraltar, so connecting the Atlantic with the Mediterranean Sea. And I went to the city to do field work. My project at the time had been to work on African migration, and I wanted to meet with Senegalese, particularly Senegalese people working, living without documents in the city. And this city is very much a holding city because it's away from the peninsula of Spain. So and it is within the land of Morocco. So actually these people are technically in Europe, but actually physically on African soil. In actual fact, when I went to the, and I won't call it a detention center, it's called the residence for people without papers. When I went there, and although it's a residence, it is in fact very much like a prison. It's outside the city center, well outside, away at the top of a hill, so that it's not easy to walk to the city. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere with fields around it. The whole building is overpopulated with people without papers, so that there were people living in tents on the hillside. When I went there, I bumped into someone who looked like he came from South Asia. He was from Bangladesh. And within a matter of 10 minutes, there were 38 men there from South Asia. They came from Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. They grouped together and were helping each other go through this experience of being in this place that they had never expected to come to. The two people whose stories I still follow, whom I'm still very much in touch with, are Mohammed. I've changed their names. They're Mohammed Shamsul and Sheikh Akbar. Their stories were very, very similar. They both came from small towns in Bangladesh, which had been affected by repeated cyclones and climate issues, where they came from fairly, not extremely poor families, but fairly poor families where there had been some sale of land, some sale of cattle, etc., in order to be able to get them their tickets to get onto a Turkish ship and from there to an Italian ship. The plan had been for both of them to come to England. And I should say that here in the UK, we have the second, outside of Bangladesh, the second largest international community of Bangladeshis here in London, particularly in the East End of London, where my university is located. They had, of course, problems to do with language, did not really understand what the Turks were saying or what the Italians were saying, but they had to move ship. And eventually they docked in Ceuta, where they were asked to leave the ship. And they at first thought that they had reached England, but they had not. They were in this Spanish city in North Africa. They spent, each of them spent over 2.5 to 3 years in that place. And of course, while they were there, they were given 3 meals a day and a bed in a shared dormitory, no income, the ability to walk around, but they could not leave the city. So the conditions were semi-prison-like. And of course, one of the big problems they had was boredom. Another one back in 2003, when mobile phones were less common, was also sort of sharing mobile phones and having the money with which to make those calls. There was one lawyer representing over 700 people. The lawyer worked in Spanish. None of them spoke Spanish. None of them understood the documentation that they had been each given. There were groupings in that location by ethnic groups. As Muslims, they had problems because, of course, the meat was not halal. They had no mosque to go to. And eventually, eventually what happened was that they were released into the peninsula. So they were put on boats, taken to the peninsula and let loose with no support at all. At this stage, both of them called me. One of them had been given a train ticket to Madrid by the authorities, another a train ticket to Barcelona. And they then I put them in touch with NGOs in both cities, and the NGOs put them in touch with Bangladeshi business people, restaurants, for example, that lent a hand. And for the next 2 or 3 years, Each of them worked in each of these cities as hawkers and peddlers selling contraband goods. They belonged to an underground network where they were selling things on the street, always vigilant whether the police was coming or not. In 2004-5, Spain had a brief change of government whereby there was a brief moment where people without papers could apply. Mohammed Shamsul was still in Barcelona at the time because he did not have any relatives in England, and so he just wanted to survive and do his best. He applied and got his citizenship, so he got his papers. Sheikh Akbar, however, had an uncle here in the UK, and he was determined to come here to the UK. So by then he had made it on foot from Madrid, somehow hitching rides to Paris, and had gotten into France without documentation. From France, he went to Calais, and from there he hid under a truck and made it to the UK. He contacted me a month after he had arrived here in the UK, and he was still suffering serious lung issues and he was unable to go and get medical aid because he was scared of saying that he had a problem and showing his face. He was living with his uncle in clandestine conditions. And he did so for about 7 years until he ended up marrying a cousin who was already British and got his papers to live in the UK. He is now a father, and he lives not far from here in the UK, but he continues to live a life where he does not have qualifications to get into any sort of serious professional line. He works in the kitchen of a restaurant. Mohammed Shamsul in Barcelona had a different story. He got his papers and worked for 8 years as a waiter in a big restaurant chain. And he made enough savings in order to get married, as well as to build a house in Bangladesh for his parents that he's very proud of. However, the 8 years as a waiter took its toll, as well as the years that he had been in limbo, on his health. And he suffered a minor stroke and is no longer able to work. But he's a very active member of the People Without Papers movement, which brings together a host of ethnic minority groups where there are particularly Latin Americans, Africans, etc., who are all lobbying for papers in Spain. And he's also taken on a semi-media role with the European TV channel that is run by Bangladesh Media. So he lives, again, a very transnational diasporic life in a Bangladesh community. Before I finish, and I want to finish very soon, I am aware of the time. I just want to also sort of say that here in the UK, of course, we're seeing as a host community, as a city, London, the UK as a country that has not only gone off and made empire around the world, but has also in the last, since the mid-1940s, received waves and waves of immigrants and refugees from around the world. We're experiencing this time of Brexit, and we're seeing that a curious phenomenon whereby when the referendum around Brexit took place, those who voted for leaving Europe and voted for Brexit were not just the majority white population, but a significant number of South Asians and long-standing immigrants to this country. And this is because there's a strong resentment to the numbers of East Europeans who had been living and working in the UK for the last 15, 20 years. And they came and they worked as builders, as nurses, as care workers, in hospitality, etc. Many of them made very significant contributions, as we see in the NHS. Now that we really need them, they're not there at this time of pandemic. But there was a feeling that the East Europeans, because of the ease of travel and the fact that they were making money here, but then building homes there in their countries and setting up retirements in their countries or somewhere else, that they were leading transnational lives where their hearts had been left at home, even though their heads were here. And that there was therefore a disturbance to the ethnic makeup of classrooms, schools, high street, public spaces, and a resistance from the majority population, from those of us who've been here for a long time, a resistance, despite the fact that many of these people themselves are either migrants themselves or people who are second generation migrants. So, and of course, the larger context for this has been the economic crisis of 2008 and everything that has followed from that, unemployment, loss of manufacturing industries, and other social and economic factors. So, to conclude, the costs of migration come alongside the pros, if you like. There are pros and cons that form part of the social facets of migration as a feature of globalization. Migration as a story of people looking for a chance in life. So there are many obstacles along the way, there are many costs, many borders. And migration is also about taking risks, about putting yourself on the line, literally to lead, to live the border, to not just cross the border, but actually to inhabit, to have the determination and the strength to inhabit that border for a long time. And that border affects not only the people who have made the journey, but also the places they come from, the people and communities they come from, and the ones that they go to. So I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for a long time, and I will welcome your questions. I've not had a chance to read through, but I would be grateful for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mayer. And now I request all the participants to kindly raise your hands if possible. Then we will directly invite you and you can directly ask question. Kindly raise your hands. There's a feature. And for like, I can see a question from Om Prakash Maji.
Mm-hmm.
Om Prakash ji, if you want to ask question, you can directly ask.
Hello, sir.
Please, please.
Ma'am, this session is very informative. My question is one: why is return migration not clear, both places, internal and international both level? Because we do not understand what is the criteria of return migration. And second question is what are the regions of the depopulation in various countries? How to overcome these problems, ma'am?
Okay, thank you. Okay, return migration. Return migration can be problematic for two reasons. Firstly, because when people migrate and go somewhere and live in a different place, they experience certain changes in their ways of life, their values, who they think they are. And that puts them somewhat at odds with who they used to be and maybe what the expectations are. So we see this very much, for example, in India, we have a very significant number of people living in the US, in Canada, people who grew up in India. There's a very large Indian diaspora, but you will see that there are certain features whereby they are slightly different from Indians who have lived in India for two reasons. Partly because they themselves have gone through this experience and changed, and partly because India also has changed. And so I can take, many instances where, for example, Indian parents will raise their children in the way in which they were raised, thinking that this is how it is done at home. But actually, home, India, has also changed and changes. So, in effect, the values or the practices are all those that belonged to a former generation, a former time. And so there is that problem. The other problem around return migration then is that there can be expectations from families that because often migration doesn't just happen because somebody wants to migrate. It's because the family has made a strategic decision that it's a good idea for one member or two members or whoever to take that journey, because there will be a sense of remittance, there will be an expectation of remittances, support, increase in social status, etc., that come with that. And returning means that you haven't gone off to fulfill what it was that you were supposed to do. So that can be one of the issues. Around depopulation, I think there are two issues in Europe. One is that Europeans are having much less children than they used to. The other is that the youth are going. So it's very typical. For example, when the COVID-19 coronavirus hit northern Italy, there was a huge number of fatalities, deaths in the mountain regions, in the north of Italy. And this is because in these areas, the vast majority of people still living there are old, very elderly people. And many of the younger people don't live there anymore. They live in the cities, and maybe they come back in the holidays or for Christmas or something to see their parents and grandparents. But and they too do not have many children. So a couple may only have one child. So over the generations, there's been progressive drop in population in these areas, but also, and that becomes exacerbated by the fact that they are emigrating to live elsewhere. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Nair. Dr. Raj, if you are here, Dr. Raj Bardule. Dr. Raj.
Can I ask one question?
Yes,
Professor
yes.
Nair? So, Professor Nair, it was very good. Actually, I was listening half of your lecture while in the taxi itself. So one question which actually India, many states are facing, that is called the old age problem. In Kerala, it is also prevalent, and in other places also. So it is a big challenge. It is not a small challenge, because remittance will not take care of everything. You need parents, you need children around, and so many other things. So what is your take on this, especially your state, I think, Kerala?
Thank
Your
you, Dr. Sada. Yeah, as you know, I have parents in Delhi, very
Yes.
elderly. My father is 101, my mother is 95. So
Mm.
they're in Delhi as I speak, and I'm here in lockdown. I haven't seen them for 1 year now. And I think my story may be a little exceptional in that my parents, are there, but it's certainly not alone. I'm one of many people of my generation of Indian origin living elsewhere. And I think this issue that we're dealing with as families, as individuals, really touches on the heart of national, communal, and personal identities, because I think everything is fine as long as everyone is fine, but as parents get very much older and need daily care, they need attention, they need love, they need company. It's a major challenge. There's the question of how the aged, what happens to people, because I think no society in the world is really prepared for old age in the way that it is being lived now, because people didn't used to live for so long, and so we don't have the right support in place, either socially or personally, in order to be able to create an ideal balance between care and at the same time for the carers to lead their own lives and to have their professional and personal commitments. There's a wonderful book on aging and on dying that was written, I think, a couple of years ago by an Indian doctor living in the US called Atul Gawande. His book is called Being Mortal, and I would really recommend that book to anybody who is dealing with the care of elderly people, but also for our own lives, for us to understand something about old age and growing old. It's a story that starts with his grandfather in the west of India, who lived in the extended joint family where care was never a problem because there was always somebody in the house. But the shift to the nuclear family, which is part of what migration has done. It's people migrate, they may take a partner or their children, but they don't take the entire family with them very often. So the shift to also, I think, changes to women's lives by women becoming professional, so that the home is often an empty space during the working week. The fact that people have multiple commitments, multiple interests, hobbies, and also all sorts of different pressures that they have to meet, financial ones, mortgages to pay, pensions to look after for themselves, etc., etc. These different pressures have put old age, the question of how we look after our elderly, on the shelf, and it's a huge challenge. For those of us who are leading transnational lives, I think it's a particularly difficult one on a day-to-day basis, and I do not have an easy answer for it. Obviously, financial security helps always, but nothing can fill questions of emotional and emotional support that are also necessary. And as older people get older, they don't hear so well, or they don't see so well. So actually digital connections, remote speaking through videos, etc., become much more difficult because they're also not part of the digital age. They don't really understand how to use these gadgets. And they don't hear very well, or they don't see very well. So it's communication becomes a problem. I don't have an answer, but I know.
Thank you. I think it answered my question.
Thank you, Professor Nair. Mr. Anisur, if you have a question. Anisur Rahman.
Thank you. I am Anisur Rahman, a returning migrant from of Bangladesh. Actually, I don't have any question. I just share my experience very shortly. Being a community worker, I have seen the migration a lot. Since long, we were raising our voice on the migration cost, means financially cost and other things. Recently, it has noted that social cost is a very important thing and raise it. So to choose this subject, I appreciate the organizer, and my sharing is that due to migration, when a male or female is migrants, their kids are suffering lots, means they are become the derail, absence of their guardian. And when a woman is migrated, husband get another married, there is one social cost. Moreover, and finally, I thanks Nayar to mention that human history is a migration history. In fact, the theories of civilization, there is one theory was nomad theory. I think this is the migrants theory. Migrants are also the cultural ambassador also. However, thank you to give me
Thank
the
you. Thank you. Absolutely. I totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. Thank you. I see there is a raised hand from Mr. Raja Sekhar Chapidi. Yeah.
Please ask us. Yes.
Yeah. Good evening.
Good evening.
Parvati Nayarji. Good lecture, and I appreciate your participation in our
Thank
session.
you.
Actually, my question and my curiosity and my intervention, okay, all three together. If migration Is there any policies related to GCM? GCM is, we have 23 objectives. Okay. Actually, recently I met our DGP. The DGP means Director General of Police. Okay. So he's a state head of Andhra Pradesh. Okay. He is interested to implement strict rules and regulations for the safe migration, especially from our Andhra Pradesh. I am from Andhra Pradesh. Especially from Andhra Pradesh, there are low category like domestic helpers are migrating very huge number, especially women. Of course, men also, they are going as drivers and everything. But they are always exploiting too much by agents. Okay, agents means in Gulf countries there are recognized by those government that agents. They have representatives in the local market, like India, in Andhra Pradesh, somewhere, anywhere. So they are exploiting the people, and so they are, every problem is like that. So we brought, of course, from last few years, we are trying to bring out this all, sorting out the problems. Okay. Now we want to regularize the agenting system or migrate to the other countries. So this what. So police, what he told, okay, we have a lot of police stations around the state. Okay, so they want to utilize that stations as a offices of the migrants for regular. But what he told, bring your policy or whatever made. So we try to implement that one. So he's asking correct policies, whatever made. So, but he is ready to implement those things. So this is what my question, and this question is not only for you, and Mr. Sada is there, and other expertise are there. So for everybody open to this one. From our Andhra Pradesh, yes, we are trying to implement a policy. For policy making, we need help from all those UP people, expertise. So this is my serious concern, and maybe tomorrow, day after tomorrow, I'll try to talk with Mr. Sadananda also regarding this issue. So I want to, at least from India, we want to make an example for this one, and because he came forward. So DGP means he's top of the police head. Okay. So this is what my this. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know, Dr. Sada, if you want to say something, I don't know.
No, nothing much to say. We'll discuss further actually. This is just initial observation as you mentioned. So policy matter, we are academicians, so we'll have to debate on the issue, then policy will form. So nothing much to say. Dr. Raj Bordale has come, I think.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Good morning. Good evening.
Good
Greetings.
morning, Professor Badri.
Yeah. I have to congratulate you. I have no words to say how much I enjoyed your lecture. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very well. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and it's of course from an academic point of view as well as from a human point of view. I think this was brilliant. It gave us a snapshot of all the issues that are at the back of this, the migration debate. What struck me was because you took us to this very emotional journey, what it means to migrate and what you leave behind, how the communities are impacted, how the individual, how societies are impacted, and so on. So it's actually very deep. So this was a very deep analysis. I just have one observation. It's not a question, probably a question, that as regards the social and personal and emotional costs of migration, right? Because there are not just the benefits, there are enormous costs which remain hidden because nobody talks about those costs. There are personal costs, family costs, social costs, emotional costs, and psychological costs. And as you said, these images, they stay with you, even though people are not able to say much, but it's a lived experience and it lives with you. Now, the question I have is that there's a lot of bragging about X number of 700 and whatever billion remittances and so on. So it's very much on a material aspect. I think the debate has focused a lot on how much the migrants are contributing to their families, to society, to their countries, and so on, without paying much due consideration to at what cost do these remittances end up on the table or in the foreign exchange reserves or with families and so on. So I think the debate now, perhaps it's important to shift to also think more about what are actually the sacrifices and the costs which stay with the people's experiences and with their lives. They may not express, but are they happy when they do that? So I think there has to be a little bit more debate on that aspect of the cost of migration. And as you said, and more on these images, I think it's very good to, rather than doing academic papers only, but doing a sort of, imageries, as you said, photography, and, to showing what goes through the minds of these people when they take this risky journey. Sometimes it's a risk. You get through, but the risk stays with you all the time because you actually took a step, not knowing where you're going or where you're going to end up. So I think a little bit more scholarship needs to go into these issues. And thank you very much. And again, I really, really enjoyed it. I'm not the only one. I'm sure there's so many others who feel the same way. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bardui, so much for
No
your
problem. Thank you.
I just want to say there's a wonderful, I once was in a wonderful photo exhibition, a short collection of photos by a German Turkish photographer. And it was basically his family photos. And what it was that he grew up in Turkey with his mother, but his father had gone to Germany as one of the guest workers. As you know, Germany has this policy whereby migrants don't get citizenship rights forever. They are on these long contracts where they work in the car factories and the various, factories in Germany. And the father used to send back photos to the family. He used to come back for 1 month every year for the summer holiday. And the rest of the time he would write letters back in the 70s. And he would send photos that when this boy was growing up, of the father dressed with a nice coat, standing next to a Mercedes car and on a nice street near a big house. So he imagined that his father had this wonderful life in Germany, which was such a clean place and everything was wonderful. But when he turned 18 and his father called for him to join him in Germany, and he went there and he found that all these years his father had lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with 6 other Turkish men, that he shaved every morning in front of a broken mirror, that they ate mostly from tinned foods and worked in factories which were cold and big and anonymous. And it was a huge shock. And I think this is, how the migrant is perceived from home and what the expectations around remittances, around care, around status, all these things are so different sometimes from the actual lived realities of it. So thank you, Professor Bardui. I think there is a lot of work to be done on this.
Thank you, Professor Nair. So, do you have any other question? You can unmute yourself. I think we do not have question, and we are also running out of time. So, thank you, Professor Nair, for your.
Thank you. I don't know if there's anything in the chat that I should reply to. If there's anything there that I haven't had a chance to read through the chat, but maybe not. If there's nothing.
Most of
comments.
I've already invited. We have included, I think, most of these things in the discussion. So now, thank you, Professor Nair, for this impressive lecture. I think we all have connected ourselves somewhere in the lecture itself. The way you conceptualized everything and the way you shared your own findings from different projects and your own understanding of the issue.
Thank you, Dr. Ranjan. Yeah, thank you to everybody for having me. And it's wonderful to have this connection. Thank you, Dr. Sada, for this
Thank
invitation,
you,
for
Professor Nair.
organizing this as well. And yeah, it's wonderful to have this network and to have the community of shared interest in this topic that is ultimately about our own lives, as you say, all
That's
of us.
true. That's true.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor
We
Nair.
hope to, like,
Thank you so much.
we'll be having another time, like we hope to have you in future also for different issues related to migration, considering the
Please
extensive
put me
work
on
we
your
have done.
mailing list for the talks, and I will attend as and when I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks for coming. And
Thank
thank you
you.
all the participants for
And the
coming.
same, yes. Thank you for the questions, for listening. Thank you very much.
Hopefully, we'll see you in our next webinar that is scheduled for on Tuesday, 19th of January 2021. Same time at 5:30 p.m., 1 hour before this, 1 hour before. So hopefully we'll see you there. So thank you very much. Thank you all the participants. Now we'll close this webinar. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Nair, once again for
Thank you.
making
Yes,
it
yes,
Thank you
yes.
so much.